leave this on. Good evening. Welcome to People's University, the Vietnam War. This is our penultimate class, meaning we have the finale next week, and that class will feature our friend Hal Gorby, and we're calling it Legacy, Wheeling, and West Virginia in the War, the Vietnam War, focusing on the war years here in West Virginia and Wheeling, which came during a period of key transition for those places. And that'll be our next class on, May 22. And on Tuesday, this Tuesday, the 20th, we'll have a visit from Peanuts creator Charles Schulz, who is portrayed in the West Virginia the Humanities Council's History Alive program. We'll also have a corresponding exhibit up here of Peanuts cartoons and collectibles on loan from Dr. Mercer. That's being put together right now. And then on the 27th, we will commemorate Lafayette's farewell tour. He came to Wheeling. Everyone okay? Iris DeRode will be here. She's an expert on the French-American alliance during the Revolution. That'll be on the 27th. There's a whole lot of things going on about Lafayette during that week. Tonight, our instructor is Zachary Taylor, and he is a doctoral candidate at Ohio University, which has supplied 3 of our professors this term. He is specializing in the history of the U.S.-Vietnamese bilateral relations after the war. His dissertation, tentatively entitled Reconciliation and Normalization, the United States and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, 1975 to 1995, examines the diplomacy between those countries that led to the establishment of diplomatic relations in July 95. Taylor has proficiency in Vietnamese and has conducted extensive research across the U.S. and plans to go to Vietnam next year for further archival research. Please welcome Zachary Taylor.
Thank you so much, Mr. Duffy. I'm really glad to be here to speak for all of you. I also see that we have several veterans in the crowd. My mom was a nurse for the VA for almost 2 decades, and she taught me at a very young age to always thank veterans, so thank you for your service. Today I'm going to be talking about the final years of the Vietnam War, so from 1972 to 1975, and I put an asterisk next to the 95 on my PowerPoint because I'm going to be going a little bit over 95, talking a little bit about the post-war years, and then I'm excited to answer any questions you may have or talk to you afterwards. So to set the stage, we're going to begin with the Easter offensive as our first main topic, but the build-up to that is to set the stage in the context in Vietnam and what the United States is currently doing in Vietnam. 1972, of course, is an election year. Richard Nixon is president, and the current policy, U.S. policy in Vietnam, is what's known as Vietnamization. And it's this withdrawal of U.S. soldiers out of Vietnam, the slow withdrawal, as well as handing over combat operations to the South Vietnamese, and that was termed Vietnamization. And of course, spring 1972, at this point, the North Vietnamese, the communist North Vietnamese forces have largely regained their strength from their kind of past offenses. Of course, this spring offensive was not the first one. You had the Tet offensive in early 1968. You had kind of this mini Tet, a smaller scale, but still a significant offensive in the middle of 1968. And so this was now going to be a very big test for U.S. and South Vietnamese soldiers and for North Vietnam as well for this Easter offensive or Spring Offensive, as it's also called. And so the North Vietnamese launched their Easter offensive, this or Spring Offensive, kind of use them interchangeably, on March 30th, 1972. It was involved over 100,000 soldiers. It was a multi-pronged attack across the DMZ. I have a map up here to kind of show you the arrows pointing to the kind of these incursions, and you really see the scale of this operation. The North Vietnamese were well equipped with Soviet and Chinese equipment, heavy artillery, and tanks. At this point, I should also mention there are fewer than 70,000 U.S. soldiers in Vietnam at this time. And so what was the ultimate outcome of this operation? It was largely a failure for the North Vietnamese. The U.S. advisors for a few reasons. The U.S. advisors played a very important role in, of course, rallying South Vietnamese units who may have had somewhat of a morale loss, but also the South Vietnamese also fought very well against North Vietnam. North Vietnamese troops and NLF, National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong soldiers. The North Vietnamese lost almost 100,000 soldiers, 100,000 casualties. The South Vietnamese had around 43,000. The Easter Offensive also left almost 1 million Vietnamese homeless as well. So kind of adding to this burgeoning refugee crisis, which you'll hear me mention a few times throughout this lecture. Of course, really kind of one of the saving graces for the South Vietnamese state and not for the North Vietnamese was the assistance of U.S. air power, as U.S. air power just constantly was a dominating factor to these operations. And so how did the U.S. respond to the Spring Offensive? Well, in kind of two ways I want to point out. One was that Richard Nixon ordered the mining of North Vietnamese ports, okay? And so the reason behind this was to stem the flow of equipment going to North Vietnam, to try to decrease the supplies that they're getting from the Soviet Union and from China. Of course, many Americans viewed this as an escalation. Again, the mining of ports had not been done yet, and it was risky, right? Because if you damage, or the idea was, perhaps those opposed, was if you damage, it's an escalation because you could perhaps get the Soviet Union, maybe involved. Of course, at this point in 1972, Richard Nixon, the Soviet Union, and China were kind of working behind the scenes, not so much with the Vietnamese on their détente. So Richard Nixon felt it was a good time, it was appropriate that he had the leverage and had the diplomatic goodwill, if you will, to mine the harbors. The second response was known as Operation Linebacker, very reminiscent of Operation Rolling Thunder, which I'm sure previous speakers talked about. And it was essentially a massive aerial bombardment of North Vietnam, and the bombings lasted until the fall, until October. And of course, the rationale behind the bombings, behind Operation Linebacker, was to turn back the communist invasions of South Vietnam, to destroy military supplies of the North Vietnamese. And also, as a side note, but of course happening concurrently to all this, was to pressure the North Vietnamese who were currently negotiating with the United States in Paris at this time. The Paris peace talks had been ongoing for several years, not really making much progress. So Richard Nixon hoped that this bombing would have an impact. In terms of numbers, the United States dropped over 150,000 tons of bombs just during this operation alone on North Vietnam. It was the first bombing campaign to use laser-guided missiles. electro-optical guided munitions, and this sort of a technology you see starting to be used during the war. It did ultimately, of course, help stall the Easter offensive. And so while this is occurring, again, as I mentioned, the Paris Peace Accords are occurring, and eventually there is a break. There's kind of an opportunity, it looks like, for there to be progress. And this occurs in October 1972, when the North Vietnamese essentially agree with the United States that President Nguyen Van Thieu, who is the president of South Vietnam, he's allowed to stay in power, and they're okay with that. And so essentially, Richard Nixon and his national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, they feel really confident. And Henry Kissinger famously says on national television, "We believe peace is at hand." He said that on October 22nd, 1972. Of course, famously, this is just 2 weeks before the 1972 election. Richard Nixon is really banking on a lot of Americans buying into this idea that peace is at hand, right? He was elected the first time largely that the war would end quickly, and while he was withdrawing U.S. soldiers, and he had withdrawn many U.S. soldiers, of course, the U.S. was still, in the war. Of course, on November 7th, Richard Nixon is reelected by a stunning margin. He defeats Senator George McGovern, and it does seem like now that he has won the election, that he has wiggle room now. But at this point, now that he's won, he really needs to end the war. He needs to end at least America's role in this conflict. And so, essentially, in December, in the winter of 1972, peace negotiations break down in Paris. And this is for a few reasons. So President Nguyen Van Thieu, right, president of South Vietnam, he refuses to agree to the terms of this developing peace agreement. He sees it as kind of, he fears that the U.S. withdrawal will just embolden the North Vietnamese, and so he presents over 60 counterpoints to the North Vietnamese and the United States to this developing Paris Peace Accords talk. While initially successful, the negotiators ultimately reach an impasse on where the DMZ, the demilitarized zone, should be. But the biggest sticking point for Nguyen Van Thieu, for the president of South Vietnam, was that North Vietnam wanted to keep its soldiers in the South, and that was something he absolutely could not agree to. Ultimately, the North Vietnamese, kind of displeased with the situation and feeling like they might have to make concessions, they ultimately demand a return to the pre-October agreement. So they're kind of going back now on this kind of, that Nguyen Van Thieu can stay in power, and ultimately the negotiations begin to fall apart. Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon discuss resuming Operation Linebacker to resume the bombing of North Vietnam, and they ultimately do resume the bombing, and they ultimately follow with an ultimatum. They tell the South Vietnamese that if this bombing and if we do end up reaching an agreement with the North Vietnamese, if you refuse to support us in this endeavor, we will simply sign an agreement without you. So ultimately, on December 18th, 1972, Operation Linebacker 2 commences, and there is a massive bombing campaign in just 11 days carried out by B-52s around the clock. It's also called the Christmas bombing because it occurs during Christmas. There are over 2 dozen U.S. aircraft that are lost, shot down. But the bombing is sustained so much that ultimately it does bring the North Vietnamese officials back to the bargaining table, and they do agree to continue the peace talks. And so with that, ultimately, with a vast majority of the U.S. troops having been withdrawn, the Paris Peace Accords are ultimately signed on January 27th, 1973. It's formally known as the Agreement on Ending the War and Restoring Peace in Vietnam, but it is signed by the South Vietnamese, by the United States, by the North Vietnamese, and by the Provisional Revolutionary Government, or the Viet Cong, or NLF. The agreement establishes a ceasefire, which essentially neither side follows, but that's what it stipulated. It allowed a 60-day period for the withdrawal of all American and foreign soldiers, the return of prisoners of war. This is a very big point. And, of course, the sticking point for the South Vietnamese was that it did allow the North Vietnamese soldiers to remain in Vietnam. Ultimately, the next day after the Paris Peace Accords, President Richard Nixon signed an executive order ending the draft and to inaugurate this all-volunteer force that we have today. On February 12th, just a couple weeks after the Paris Peace Accords are signed, you have Operation Homecoming, which is the operation that you see where prisoners of war are exchanged on both sides. You have the U.S. Air Force landing in North Vietnam, and from February 12th to March 29th, U.S. aircraft are they take roughly 600 American military and civilian prisoners back to the United States. And I have a video here that hopefully Mr. Duffy and I made sure it works. And it's from the Ken Burns documentary. I don't know if any of you have ever watched the Ken Burns Vietnam War documentary. It's just a short clip from that.
Today, the largest contingents of repatriated prisoners so far, 60 men, were flown from Clark to Travis Air Force Base, California.
Today's most dramatic moment came when Everett Alvarez made his happy trek down the ramp, home at last. For almost as long as most Americans have been aware of Vietnam, Lieutenant Commander Alvarez has been a prisoner in Hanoi. He was shot down August 5th, 1964, during the first raids flown in retaliation for the Tonkin Gulf incident. And finally, today, he was home.
For years and years, we dreamed of this day, and we kept faith. Faith in God, in our president, and in our country.
Hal Kushner's turn came in mid-March.
Oh, beautiful, for heroes proved in liberating strife.
And then they called their name, and I walked out in the sunlight, and the first thing I saw was a girl in a miniskirt. She was a reporter for one of the news organizations. I'd never seen a real live miniskirt.
And mercy more than life.
And there was a table with the Vietnamese and American authorities on one side, and there was a brigadier general, Air Force general in Class A uniform, and he looked magnificent. And I looked at him, and he had breadth, he had thickness that we didn't have. And his hair was, he had on a garrison cap, and his hair was plump and moist. And our hair was like straw, you know, it was dry, and we were skinny. And I went out and I saluted, which was a courtesy that had been denied us for so many years. And he saluted me, and I shook hands with him, and he hugged me. He actually hugged me, and he said, "Welcome home, Major. We're glad to see you, Doctor." And the tears were streaming down his cheeks. And it was just a powerful moment.
My purple mountain majesty.
And then this liaison officer, they called it, came out and got me and escorted me on this C-141. It was this beautiful white airplane with a flag, an American flag on the tail, and USAF.
You know, God done shed his grace on thee.
And they had these real cute flight nurses on there. They were all tall and blonde, and, you know, they were just gorgeous. And we got on this thing, and she said, this nurse, we sat in these seats, and she said, "We have anything you want, you know, what do you want?" And I wanted a Coke with crushed ice and some chewing gum.
You know, I wish I had somebody to help me sing this. America, I love you, America. You see, my God, he done shed his grace on thee. And you ought to love him for it, because he crowned that good. He told me he would. Every brotherhood from sea to shining sea. Oh, Lord, I thank you, Lord.
Yeah, it really is very incredible. Hal Kushner was giving a talk last year in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and my mom, who watched this documentary with me, actually called me up, and she goes, "Do you remember, you know, from the documentary?" So she met Hal Kushner, and just, you know, very polite and an incredible story. So yeah, if you haven't seen that documentary, I certainly recommend it. So you have the exchange of POWs. The U.S. military involvement role in Vietnam is officially over. So now it's solely on the South Vietnamese. There's still U.S. soldiers in Vietnam, but solely just for protective purposes, you know, U.S. establishment and whatnot. And so just to kind of give it, you know, kind of to show the mindset for the United States, the War Powers Act, Congress quickly passes in 1973, and it essentially gives Congress much greater exercise and involvement in U.S. foreign policy. It requires the president to report to Congress before deploying U.S. military forces, limits the duration of deployment from 60 to 90 days, unless having congressional approval for extension. And so you kind of see this, you start to see Congress really inject itself in this foreign policy decision-making. Another, I guess you would say, kind of blow, the pillar fall for the South Vietnamese having support from the United States, I argue, I would say, is Richard Nixon, of course, resigning in August 1974. This is a very big deal. Of course, he resigns because of Watergate, but for the South Vietnamese, Richard Nixon promised Nguyen Van Thieu that should North Vietnam press its offensive at any time, that the United States would be there. Well, now you have, of course, Gerald Ford succeeding him. He asks, just less than a month after Richard Nixon resigns, he asks Congress to for more aid, but Congress votes to reduce military aid to South Vietnam from $1 billion to $700 million. Still a lot, but of course you kind of see the direction that this is going. The total U.S. military presence by the end of 1974, by December 31st, 1974, is just 50 personnel. Again, primarily at the U.S. Embassy.
Why do you need a student checking account from Unified Bank? Graduation gifts,
We have
summer
two
jobs, and
quick
back to school. We are
advertisements,
Unified.
so I apologize.
Saigon, April the 30th, 8 o'clock. The last American helicopter on the roof of the American embassy prepares to lift off the last of the evacuees fleeing before the advancing communist armies. Back in the city, normal patterns of behavior broke down. In a climate of every man for himself, American homes, offices, and stores were looted of everything. The discarded equipment even ran to tanks, some damaged, but some also abandoned intact by their crews as they fled before the communists. And then, shortly after midday, came the climax of 30 years of fighting. The first North Vietnamese troops entered the city, packed into trucks that flew the red and blue flag of the Communist Provisional Revolutionary Government, the PRG. Those who failed on that last day to get a place on the helicopters and who had reason to fear the communist takeover made for the only route that still offered a chance of escape, the Saigon River. Hundreds scrambled in panic onto any boats they could reach, not caring how they got aboard or what they left behind.
Okay, so how did we get to that point? How did we, to kind of review the fall of Saigon? We're already at the early 1975. We started just, 25 minutes ago at the Easter Offensive. So North Vietnam had 2 years to build back up its forces. It had been, of course, fighting the war, fighting with South Vietnam. But again, the U.S. military presence is, for the most part, it was diminished. And so in late 1974, the North Vietnamese decide to renew their offensive to capture, fully on capture territory in South Vietnam. And so they begin the offensive just to see how it goes. Okay, and so on March 1st, you have the fall of I Corps. Of course, South Vietnam is divided into 4 corps, as how the U.S. divided it. And so the I Corps, or the first corps, was the northernmost corps, closest to North Vietnam. And so President Thieu orders his commanders to move 2 divisions of South Vietnamese soldiers to the Saigon area. And so I Corps is defended only by 3 then South Vietnamese divisions. And Highway 1 becomes choked with refugees. It complicates troop movements. 5 North Vietnamese divisions with armor, artillery, they press east. They cut Highway 1, and they force the South Vietnamese to withdraw towards central Vietnam, farther south. And with the lack of government support, all of I Corps collapses, meaning now South Vietnam has just 3 corps left. Okay, so from the North Vietnamese, they now see this as going pretty well. The U.S. is not sending an air support. The U.S., of course, doesn't have soldiers there. So they feel like they can push the offensive. On March 11th, President Nguyen Van Thieu decides to withdraw all forces. It's a very controversial decision. Many argue, if he hadn't done this, what would have happened? But ultimately, he decides to withdraw all South Vietnamese forces, closer to Saigon. And so, ultimately, you have I Corps that falls as well. Hue, of course, the old imperial city in South Vietnam, also eventually falls on March 24th, after having been evacuated by the South Vietnamese. Many of the city's residents joined the masses of refugees retreating south and to the east along the coast. And on April 4th, you have what's known as Operation Baby Lift. I don't know, some of you might have heard of Operation Baby Lift before. It was designed by the United States. President Gerald Ford thought it would be a really great humanitarian operation, and it was essentially the movement of 2,600 Vietnamese children from Saigon to the United States. They called it Operation Baby Lift. Unfortunately, one of the planes carrying 300 people on it ended up crashing very shortly after it took off, and nearly half of those on board, most of them who were children, ended up dying. And it was just a terrible, terrible defeat, and looked really awful on this withdrawal. But again, you kind of see that most of the children that are taken out of Saigon are adopted ultimately by families in the United States, Canada, Australia, and elsewhere in Europe. On April 10th, President Gerald Ford makes a plea to Congress asking for almost $1 billion to essentially save what he views as save South Vietnam from collapse. Congress only approves $150 million, and it's primarily meant for humanitarian purposes, to evacuate South Vietnamese, to of course get U.S. personnel out of South Vietnam. Also want to make a mention, because it's something I'll be eventually wrapping up with, that in neighboring Cambodia, the capital of Phnom Penh falls to the communist Khmer Rouge on April 17th. Okay, so they ultimately achieve their revolution, as they'll kind of brag, amongst themselves. They complete their revolution before their North Vietnamese neighbors. On April 21st, the President Nguyen Van Thieu of South Vietnam, he resigns. And then the vice president kind of becomes this next leader, Tran Van Huong. He's unable to initiate negotiations with North Vietnam, and he ultimately turns over to the government to General Duong Van Minh, or also known as Big Minh, because he is a very tall Vietnamese person, so they call him, Big Minh's his nickname. On April 29th, just the day before South Vietnam collapses, Saigon is captured, Gerald Ford orders Operation Frequent Wind. This is the operation where all U.S. personnel are to get out of South Vietnam. They are leaving. Of course, at this time as well, almost 140,000 South Vietnamese are airlifted. They leave on boats to the 7th Fleet, which is offshore, off the coast of South Vietnam. You have 800 U.S. Marines providing security for the operation, and helicopters evacuate 7,000 personnel as well, again, Vietnamese and Americans. After Operation Frequent Wind ends, of course, you have the U.S. picking up multiple Vietnamese refugees at this point. And that's, of course, you saw that in the video, just the chaos that is overcome of Saigon, and people really trying to free. They don't want to fall under control of the communist North Vietnamese. The departure of the 7th Fleet marks the conclusion of 3 decades of American involvement in Vietnam. Saigon falls to Vietnamese troops, and ultimately that ends the Vietnam War. Now, again, here's kind of where the asterisk plays a part. I want to talk a little bit about the aftermath, about the post-war period. In the immediate aftermath of the Vietnam War, the United States is out. South Vietnam no longer exists. You have the North Vietnamese government essentially systematically rounding up, no one really knows the exact number, it could be 1 million South Vietnamese who had worked cooperated with the United States, worked in the South Vietnamese government, were soldiers in the South Vietnamese military, puts them into re-education camps. These were camps where they would do hard labor. They would, of course, be get the teachings of Marxism and what have you. And they were initially told, many of them, that they would only be in there for 10 days, a month tops. Many of them were in there for years. And again, they were hard labor camps, and there was no getting out unless you were let out. Eventually, in the 1980s, during the Reagan administration, when relations improved between the United States and Vietnam, we in the United States, our government, and again with the Vietnamese government, organized resettlement programs for re-education camp prisoners who had been released. But again, so you have re-education camps. You also have this transformation of South Vietnam into a socialist country. So private businesses are closed. You have the government, the state, essentially taking over. And the South Vietnamese. There's many reports from foreign diplomats who go to South Vietnam, and even though the South Vietnamese economy and government, it was very corrupt. It was the market system was simply more vibrant than the command system that was in the north. But the North Vietnamese changed all that. Also want to touch on the refugee crisis, because you've heard me mention that a couple times. With the re-education camps, this lack of economic opportunity, family separation, and the conditions just not, obviously deteriorating very quickly, you have what's known as the Indo-Chinese refugee crisis that really begins right after the war ends and lasts for almost 20 years. And essentially you see over 1 million, 1.2 million alone Vietnamese are resettled in the United States. But there's this exodus out of Vietnam and out of Indochina. I just focus on Vietnam for right now. I'll touch on Cambodia in just a moment. But yeah, you have these Vietnamese are desperate to flee, and so you have what's known as they called them boat people, right? Boat refugees. These were Vietnamese who would flee by very rickety boats to try to get to Thailand, to Malaysia, to Hong Kong, any other country in Southeast Asia. There's no exact number, but some estimate as many as 400,000 may have drowned at sea trying to escape. It's just a staggering number, of trying to flee Vietnam. And so the relations for neighboring powers in Cambodia, I mentioned the Khmer Rouge. It's worth mentioning that the Vietnamese and Khmer Rouge did work with each other, right? Of course, you've all heard of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, right? That went through Laos and Cambodia. And so the Khmer Rouge and the North Vietnamese communists did support each other. But very quickly after the war, the Cambodian communists started to essentially, get very upset with the North Vietnamese because they felt that North Vietnam, or I guess at this point Vietnam, was essentially encroaching on their territory, which there was some truth to that. And so ultimately you have cross-border incursions occurring between Cambodia and Vietnam. I'll come back to this in just a moment, kind of setting the stage for this massive conflict. For China, the same sort of goes with the Chinese and Vietnamese. Again, China had supported Vietnam in its war for decades. Now the Chinese kind of were like, you have to kind of go off on your own now. And also, you need to support us in this conflict that we're having with Russia. Okay? Because at this time, the Soviet Union and China, they were not allies anymore. They had different visions for communism, and they were both in a way vying for support of Vietnam. And Vietnam ultimately sided on the side of the Soviet Union. And so who did China then lean into in Indochina? They leaned into Cambodia. So now you have China and Cambodia, the Soviet Union, and Vietnam. And ultimately, where does the United States stand in all that? The United States primarily sides with China and somewhat by de facto Cambodia. It's obviously very controversial. the official line was that the United States did not support the Khmer Rouge at all, which they didn't supply any aid to the Khmer Rouge, but that certainly we can certainly discuss that at other times. But in any case, this conflict that develops is what's known as the Third Indochina War. Okay, and so ultimately in December 1978, you have the Vietnamese invade Cambodia to overthrow Pol Pot. He, of course, is the ruler of the Khmer Rouge, and they establish a government. They, meaning the Vietnamese, establish a government in Cambodia. You can see this map up here. I believe it's in German, so I apologize, but I figured you all would kind of be able to. So Cambodia, you can see in the pink color down there, and the lines, you can kind of see where Vietnam invades. And ultimately, for a decade, the Third Indochina War, they call it the Third Indochina War because the First Indochina War was the French versus the Vietnamese, second was the United States versus the Vietnamese, and the third being the Vietnamese versus Cambodia, and by extension, China and its supporters as well. In February 1979, you have China invading very briefly Vietnam for about a 3-week war. It was a very short war, but about 50,000 people died on both sides. And so you just have this devastation in Vietnam. I'll quickly play one video.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Barbara Walter, special reports. And tonight from New York, Max Robinson, Peter Jennings, and Frank Reynolds.
Elsewhere overseas today, Vietnam and Cambodia are escalating their conflict. Cambodia said today that Vietnamese fighter planes bombed only 35 miles from Phnom Penh, and further that there is heavy fighting underway on the border. China, which is Cambodia's principal ally today, accused Vietnam of turning the struggle into a full-scale war. As Jim Laurie reports tonight, the Chinese are conditioning their own citizens for war.
This parade in Nanning, China, 75 miles from the Vietnam border, was supposed to be part of an ordinary anniversary celebration, but with it came a strong warning for people here to prepare for war. Peking accuses Hanoi of escalating anti-Chinese attacks as a diversion from its widening war with Cambodia. Both the escalation and the saber rattling has alarmed Asian leaders and prompted the U.S. State Department to voice its concern. The major flashpoint is here, along the Vietnam-Cambodia border. Western military analysts say the Vietnamese have moved nearly 50 miles into Cambodia, the aim to set up in the city of Crotier the newly announced Cambodian Liberation Movement. This film, shot by a French photographer along the border last summer, shows some of the hardware Vietnam has to wage that offensive. American-built equipment, 13 Army divisions, and 30,000 Vietnamese-trained Cambodian guerrillas. Using this propaganda film, Cambodia has put up a brave face. China, Cambodia's major ally, has advised the Cambodians to take to the jungles and fight a protracted war. The leader of the oppressive Cambodian regime, Pol Pot, admits he may have to give up his eastern territory. But what concerns analysts most is the possibility of further escalation. Right now, Vietnam is somewhat restrained by fear of Chinese retaliation. China is cautious because the Soviet Union, Vietnam's main backer, could intervene directly. But as one diplomat here put it, what if one of these forces miscalculates? Jim Laurie, ABC News in Hong Kong.
Right, so all I can say is it really is just a mess. You have, during this Third Indochina War that lasts another 10 years, the state of Vietnam, it's really rough. The economy ultimately is in shambles. It enters what's known as the subsidy period, which, what do I mean by subsidy period? It's the Soviet Union is essentially subsidizing the entire Vietnamese economy. So it's very weak. And it's not until 1986 when Vietnam essentially embraces a market economy and opens itself up to the world, and essentially really makes efforts to withdraw its forces from Cambodia, because the entire world, for the most part, was saying we're not going to deal with, especially the United States, we're not going to establish ties with you until you remove your troops from Cambodia. And so they finally did in the end of 1989. And so that, coupled with Vietnam actively embracing a market economy, coupled with the end of the Cold War, that is essentially when Vietnam really found itself in peace. And what I find really fascinating is the post-Vietnam War foreign minister for Vietnam, Nguyen Co Thach, famously said that Vietnam won the war but lost the peace. And I felt that was really accurate in describing Vietnam and its post-war, the post-war conditions. So that is where I will leave this, so we have plenty of time for questions. And thank you again so much. I really enjoyed speaking to all of you.
Does anybody have any questions? The question was, have we learned anything?
Have we from
As a nation, have we learned anything in your opinion?
Have we from the Vietnam War? Yep. Well, we were just talking about that, I feel like, before the talk began. It's difficult to say. If you look at recent cases, right, recent conflicts the United States was in, very similar outcome to Vietnam. Right, and of course George
Hadn't learned a thing.
Right, and of course George H.W. Bush said, something like, "By God, we've beat the Vietnam War syndrome, or the Vietnam syndrome," right? This idea that the United States was afraid to get involved in foreign affairs. Yeah, right. So it does seem counterproductive. I think all I could say is that it's important to continue studying the Vietnam War, and of course, as you bring up, even more recent conflicts, and hopefully one day there will be decisions made that lead to different outcomes.
I hope so.
I do as well. Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Just raise your hand, I'll come to you with the mic.
I have just a couple. What does Vietnam exist on today? Do they have minerals? What would be their?
They're like natural resources.
You know, what provides them income?
Oh, well, today Vietnam is certainly a growing economic. It's really actually quite incredible. If you look at, for example, neighboring Thailand, you can see up here on the map, which was supported by the United States for some time, a U.S. ally, and Vietnam. The gross domestic product of both countries is really quite close. Thailand is still ahead, but Vietnam is catching up very quickly. And Vietnam, after the war, certainly after the Third Indochina War, had a really young population. I mean, I don't remember the exact numbers, but a growing population. They have a population of around 100 million now, and that occurred really very quickly. And so they produce a lot of the products. They're one of the United States' biggest trading partners, for example. And of course, they're China's biggest trading partner, or China is their biggest trading partner. And so Vietnam's foreign policy after beginning in 1986 was to essentially have peace with everyone, to stay neutral in conflicts, and that didn't just apply to war, that applied to trade, to the economy, because they felt that if they could grow the standard of living, then their country could thrive, because it had been a very poor very poor country. But they are involved as well. You know, they're a huge exporter in terms of other sources, you know, of rice. You know, they're involved in oil, you know, off the coast. So they are still, you know, they're still experimenting, I think, but they are learning, and you know, it's certainly a growing economy.
Okay, Cambodia and Laos are communist, right?
They are not anymore.
Oh,
No,
so what do
Laos.
they-
Well. So Laos still is to a degree, and Cambodia technically not, but they all have you know, one-party systems in the sense that. You know, Vietnam, of course, is communist to this day. The Communist Party controls Vietnam. The government that came out of the Third Indochina War in Cambodia, the one that actually Vietnam ended up propping up, is still the government that's essentially the man who ended up being propped up by the Vietnamese is still the man in charge. So he's been in charge for decades at this point. And I'd have to look more into Laotian politics, but they opened up their and you know, they never kind of were as isolated, so to speak, as much as Vietnam, in the sense of they opened up and improved relations with China before the Vietnamese did, for example. But yeah, there's a very good question.
Okay, what about Thailand? Thailand seems to be more democratic.
It is.
I mean, how is it run? By what?
It is ultimately more. You know, democratic than Vietnam, but it is still, you know, very, you know, it can be subject to coups, to military coups. It has a history of that, meaning the military, you know, will, if they don't approve of a policy, they will overthrow and establish a new government. And so you bring up very good points, right? That this kind of this wave of democracy that kind of came about the end of the Cold War in places like, you know, South Korea, Taiwan, you know, did not land everywhere. And in fact, in a lot of cases, there's been a regression, right, in parts of the world. But all the same, Thailand was still an ally of the United States for quite a Western ally of the United States. Thailand is where, during the Third Indochina War, that Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge were stationed along the border. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure thing. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Can you tell us again, I didn't quite understand why Vietnam decided to invade Cambodia?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Yeah, I kind of brushed over it. So right after the end of the Vietnam War, the Khmer Rouge, right, the communists in Cambodia, they were in control of Cambodia, and of course Vietnam, communists. And Pol Pot he felt that Vietnam had this grand kind of plan to take over all of Indochina. It's called the Indo-Chinese Federation. Vietnam had troops in Laos, right? And Pol Pot was worried that Vietnam would do the same to itself. So Pol Pot acted very aggressively. You know, we were talking about the killing fields before under Pol Pot's rule, almost 20% of Cambodia's population was killed, right, in the killing fields. So Pol Pot began essentially attacking Vietnam, doing cross-border incursions, would kill hundreds here, maybe 1,000 there, just kind of, and then Vietnam started to respond. Now, the Vietnamese did try for several years after 1975 to decrease, to de-escalate the conflict, saying, hey, you know, to Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge, you know, we don't need to do this. We can, you know, further the communist revolution, you know, whatever the propaganda they're saying. Pol Pot was not about it. He did not appreciate that, didn't approve of that sentiment. He essentially wanted Vietnam. He was very paranoid. And so in any case, in the beginning of 1978, Vietnam, the government essentially decided, okay, these cross-border incursions are not going to stop. We need to do something about Pol Pot. And so it took a year almost of planning. And as you heard in the video, Vietnam was worried about China. But in November of 1978, so just 1 month before they invaded, the Vietnamese government went to Moscow in the Soviet Union and in Russia, and they signed an alliance with the Soviet Union. And so they felt very, very comfortable by that point to take down Pol Pot, right? Because again, the Khmer Rouge, Pol Pot had the support of China. And so they invaded at the end of December, and they captured Phnom Penh in less than 2 weeks, in about 2 weeks, just to give you an example. The Khmer Rouge, they put up some fight, but these are Vietnamese soldiers who had been in war for decades. They were well armed, they were very good at fighting, and so it was pretty easy for them to overthrow. And even though China did respond 2 months later by invading northern Vietnam for just a couple weeks, the Soviet Union didn't really respond in a military way. All they did really was, send hundreds of thousands of troops along China's northern border as a show of force. Like, you keep this up, we might respond. But ultimately, yeah, it was like a quagmire. People have called the Third Indochina War Vietnam's Vietnam because it was a prolonged, guerrilla war, and they were losing money and soldiers, and their people were, eventually it was just their people were like, the Communist Party in Vietnam said if we want to stay in power, which they did, we need to actually raise the standard of living for the Vietnamese. Okay, we couldn't have just told them for decades we defeated the imperialist French, we defeated the imperialist Americans, but they're all still very, very poor, right? In fact, poorer in the 80s than they were during the 70s even. So they were like, we need to change, right? So they followed kind of, what China did under Deng Xiaoping. They remained in power, but they became more of a capitalist market system. Sorry, that kind of answers maybe beyond your question, but I appreciate that.
Anybody else have a question? All right, thank you so much.
Thank